Rebecca Dawson's entire body tensed as she saw the familiar silhouette approaching her small homestead. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard as Horace Bingham, the richest man in Tulsa, Oklahoma Territory, dismounted from his gleaming black stallion. It was 1889, and at 32 years of age, Rebecca had just received her third marriage proposal rejection in as many months, all citing the same cruel reason. "Miss Dawson," Horace called out, removing his hat as he approached the porch where she stood with her arms crossed defensively. "I've given your proposition considerable thought." Rebecca already knew his answer from the uncomfortable way he shifted his weight. "And," she prompted, refusing to make this easier for him, "you're a fine woman, Miss Dawson, hardworking, respectable, good with numbers." He cleared his throat. "But I'm looking to start a family, and well, at your age." The familiar sting of rejection burned her cheeks, but Rebecca maintained her composure. "You mean I'm too old to bear children? Just say it plainly, Mr. Bingham." Horace had the decency to look ashamed. "I need a younger bride." "I'm sorry." He placed his hat back atop his head. "Good day, Miss Dawson." Rebecca watched him ride away, her fingernails digging into her palms. She had hoped this time would be different. Horace was nearly 40 himself, and she thought perhaps he might value companionship over fertility. She was wrong. She turned back toward her small but tidy home. 4 years ago, after her father's death, Rebecca had inherited this modest homestead on the outskirts of Tulsa. While she managed the accounts for 3 businesses in town and made enough to support herself, the loneliness was becoming unbearable. A partnership, that's all she wanted. Someone to share her days with as the years stretched forward. The problem wasn't finding men interested in marriage. The Oklahoma Territory had plenty of bachelors seeking wives. The problem was finding one who didn't immediately dismiss her upon learning her age. In their eyes, 32 might as well be 60. Rebecca sighed and retreated into her home as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, another day of whispers from the town busybodies, another day of wondering if she was destined to grow old alone on this plot of land. What she couldn't possibly know was that 50 miles away, a man named Roy Hollister was riding toward Tulsa, carrying nothing but his reputation, a handful of possessions, and a very different perspective on what made a woman worth loving. Roy guided his horse through the rising dust of the trail, squinting against the harsh Oklahoma sun. His worn leather vest and faded blue bandana had seen better days, much like the man himself. At 38, Roy had spent most of his adult life drifting between cattle drives, ranch work, and the occasional stint as a hired gun when money got tight. He wasn't running from anything specific anymore. Those days were behind him, but the restlessness never quite left his blood. Still, lately, something had changed. The endless horizon no longer called to him with the same urgency. Instead, he found himself wondering what it might be like to wake up in the same bed more than a few weeks in a row. The sign for Tulsa appeared in the distance, and Roy adjusted his worn Stetson. He'd heard there was steady work to be found here, perhaps even a small ranch that needed a foreman. Something permanent, or at least as permanent as life out here could be. As Roy rode into town, the familiar sights and sounds greeted him: the clanging from the blacksmith shop, women in practical dresses hurrying along wooden sidewalks, men lounging outside the saloon. Every frontier town had its own character, but they all shared the same bones. He dismounted outside the hotel, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. After securing lodging, Roy made his way to the saloon. Information flowed as freely as whiskey in such establishments, and he needed both after the long ride. The saloon was busy but not crowded. Roy ordered a whiskey and leaned against the bar, surveying the room. Most patrons paid him no mind. Another dusty cowboy wasn't worth much attention in these parts. New in town, the bartender slid his drink across the polished wood. Just arrived, Roy confirmed. Heard there might be work. What kind you looking for? Ranch work. Been a foreman before. Good with horses, better with cattle. The bartender nodded thoughtfully. Henderson's place about 5 miles east might be hiring. Lost his foreman last month to a bad fall. Man still recovering over at Doc Miller's place. Roy took a slow sip of his whiskey. Might pay him a visit tomorrow. If you're looking for something sooner, Mason's General Store needs help unloading a big shipment tomorrow morning. Pays fair. Appreciate the information. Roy placed a coin on the counter and turned to find a table. As he settled into a corner spot, he overheard a conversation from nearby patrons. Turned down another one today. That's 3 now, said a heavyset man with mutton chops. Horace Bingham, asked his companion. The very same. Said he needs someone younger who can give him sons. The first man chuckled. Can't blame him there. What's Dawson thinking anyway? Woman her age should be grateful for any offer. Beautiful ledger books won't keep her warm at night, the second man said, prompting laughter. Roy's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on his drink. It wasn't his business, and he hadn't come to Tulsa looking for trouble. Still, the conversation left a sour taste in his mouth that the whiskey couldn't wash away. The next morning found Roy at Mason's General Store, helping to unload crates of supplies from a wagon. The work was straightforward, and Mr. Mason seemed pleased with his efficiency. You handle yourself well, Mr. Hollister, Mason commented as Roy stacked the last of the flour sacks. Need someone regular if you're staying in town. Appreciate the offer, but I'm looking for ranch work, Roy replied, wiping sweat from his brow. Heading out to Henderson's place this afternoon, Mason nodded. Fair enough. Let me get your pay. As Mason disappeared into the back of the store, the bell above the door chimed. Roy glanced up to see a woman enter. She was tall and carried herself with dignity, her chestnut hair pulled back into a practical bun. She wore a simple blue dress, neither fashionable nor shabby. But it was her eyes that caught Roy's attention, intelligent and deep brown, with a hint of sadness that seemed at odds with her composed expression. Good morning, Mr. Mason, she called out, before noticing that the proprietor wasn't behind the counter. Her eyes briefly met Roy's before she looked away. Mason emerged from the back room. Miss Dawson, your order came in on today's wagon. Let me fetch it for you. Roy straightened up, recalling the conversation from the previous night. So this was the woman they'd been discussing. Thank you, she replied, her voice pleasant but reserved. While Mason gathered her items, an uncomfortable silence filled the store. Roy found himself wanting to say something, but nothing appropriate came to mind. Instead, he accepted his payment from Mason when the man returned. Miss Dawson, this is Mr. Hollister. Just arrived in town yesterday, Mason said, making introductions as he placed a package on the counter. Rebecca nodded politely. Welcome to Tulsa, Mr. Hollister. Madam, Roy replied with a slight tip of his hat. Pleasure to meet you. She paid for her goods and turned to leave, but paused at the door. Mr. Mason, I'll be by Friday to go over your quarterly accounts if that suits. As always, Miss Dawson. Your organization keeps this place running smoothly. After she left, Mason chuckled. Fine woman, that Rebecca Dawson. Sharp as a tack with numbers. Handles the books for half the businesses in town. Roy nodded, watching through the window as she walked down the street. Seems capable. Oh, she is. Runs her own homestead too since her father passed. Shame about her prospects, though. Despite himself, Roy asked, what prospects would those be? Mason looked surprised at his interest. Marriage, of course. Getting to be that age, you know. Most men around here want younger wives who can bear children. She's had a string of rejections lately. Town's been talking." Roy frowned. "Seems like the town should find better things to discuss." Mason shrugged. "Small town, not much else happens." Roy pocketed his pay and headed for the door. "Thanks for the work, Mr. Mason." As he stepped onto the boardwalk, Roy spotted Rebecca Dawson again, now engaged in conversation with an older woman who was speaking in hushed but clearly distressed tones. Even from a distance, he could see the compassion in Rebecca's expression as she listened intently. There was something compelling about her quiet strength. Shaking his head to clear his thoughts, Roy reminded himself that he had come to Tulsa for work, not to get involved in local matters or the personal life of a woman he'd barely met. With that resolution firmly in mind, he headed toward the livery to retrieve his horse and ride out to Henderson's ranch. The Henderson ranch sprawled across a decent plot of land east of town. The main house was modest but well-maintained, with a large barn and several corrals visible from the approach. As Roy rode in, he noted the condition of the fence lines and the cattle visible in the distance, all indicators of how the place was run. A stocky man in his 50s emerged from the barn, watching Roy's approach with a cautious expression. "Mr. Henderson," Roy called out as he dismounted. "That's right. What can I do for you?" "Name's Roy Hollister. Heard in town you might be looking for a new foreman." Henderson studied him for a long moment. "Got experience. 15 years with cattle. Worked as foreman at the Circle T in Texas for 3 years, then the Lazy S in Kansas for another 2. "Why'd you leave?" "Wanted a change of scenery," Roy replied evenly. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Henderson seemed to consider this. "My last foreman's laid up with a broken leg and 3 cracked ribs. Doc says he won't be fit for hard work again. You any good with a gun?" "Good enough. Had some trouble with rustlers," Henderson nodded. "Some. Not as bad as other parts, but enough to be concerned." He gestured toward the barn. "Let's see how you handle yourself. Got a herd needs moving to the north pasture." For the next 2 hours, Roy demonstrated his skills with horses and cattle, working alongside Henderson's ranch hands. By the end, even the skeptical owner seemed impressed. "You know your business," Henderson acknowledged as they walked back to the main house. "Pays fair room and board plus $40 a month. You answer to me and I expect loyalty and hard work." "Sounds reasonable," Roy agreed. "There's a small cabin for the foreman about a 1/4 mile that way," Henderson pointed. "Nothing fancy, but it's private. You can move in today if you want the job." Roy extended his hand. "I'll take it." With the agreement sealed, Roy rode back to town to collect his few possessions from the hotel. The position offered exactly what he'd been looking for: steady work, a place of his own, and the chance to put down roots, at least for a while. As he passed Mason's store on his way out of town, he noticed Rebecca Dawson again, this time exiting the bank. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a polite nod of recognition. Roy tipped his hat in response, trying to ignore the inexplicable pull he felt toward this woman he barely knew. The following weeks settled into a rhythm for Roy. The work at Henderson's ranch was demanding but satisfying, and he found himself enjoying the stability. He made occasional trips into Tulsa for supplies, each time hoping for and simultaneously dreading a chance encounter with Rebecca Dawson. One Saturday afternoon in late October, his wishes were granted when he entered the general store to find Rebecca discussing an order with Mr. Mason. "Mr. Hollister," Mason greeted him. "How's life treating you out at Henderson's?" "Can't complain," Roy replied, acutely aware of Rebecca's presence. "Just need some supplies." Rebecca gathered her purchases. "I should be going. Good day, Mr. Mason." She turned to Roy. "Mr. Hollister." "Miss Dawson," Roy said, then found himself adding, "May I walk you to your wagon?" Surprise flickered across her face, followed by a cautious smile. "That's kind of you, Mr. Hollister, but unnecessary. Wouldn't be proper to call it kindness when it's just common courtesy," Roy said, his usual gruffness softening slightly. Something in his tone must have convinced her, for she nodded. "Very well." After quickly purchasing his supplies, Roy followed Rebecca outside. She had a small wagon hitched to a sturdy mare. "Your homestead far?" he asked, helping her load her packages. "About 3 miles northwest of town," she replied. "It's not much, but it's mine." Roy nodded, appreciating her obvious pride. "Heard you keep books for businesses in town." "Yes," she said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "Does that surprise you, Mr. Hollister?" "Not at all," he answered honestly. "Always had more respect for those good with numbers. Never was myself." This earned him a genuine smile that transformed her face, making her look younger and somehow more vibrant. "It's a skill like any other. Some people have a way with horses or cattle. I have a way with ledgers. Both valuable in their own right," Roy agreed. A moment of comfortable silence passed between them before Rebecca spoke again. "I should get back. There's still daylight for chores." "Of course." Roy helped her up onto the wagon seat. "Miss Dawson, I was wondering, Rebecca." A voice interrupted him. They turned to see a round woman hurrying toward them, her expression pinched with concern. "Oh, Rebecca, thank goodness I caught you. Mrs. Whitfield, what's wrong?" Rebecca asked. "It's my Jonah," the woman said, wringing her hands. "His fever's gotten worse and I can't leave to get the medicine from Doc Miller. Emily's watching him now, but I'll go," Rebecca said immediately. "Don't worry, Clara." "But your chores can wait," Rebecca finished firmly. "Family comes first." Roy stepped forward. "I can ride out to Doc Miller's and bring back what you need." Both women looked at him in surprise. "Mr. Hollister, that's very kind, but," Rebecca began. "No arguments, Miss Dawson. The boy needs medicine. I'm on horseback and can get there faster." Roy's tone brooked no argument. "Mrs. Whitfield, what does your son need?" After getting instructions from the grateful mother, Roy mounted his horse and set off at a brisk pace. By the time he returned with the medicine, Rebecca was at the Whitfield home, reading to a feverish 7-year-old boy while his mother prepared cool compresses. The relief on Clara Whitfield's face when Roy arrived with the medicine was palpable. "Bless you, Mr. Hollister." Roy handed over the small bottle. "Doc says to give him 1 spoonful now and another before bed. Should break the fever by morning." Rebecca watched him with a new appreciation in her eyes. "That was very kind of you." Roy shrugged off the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," she said quietly. After ensuring the boy took his medicine, Rebecca gathered her things to leave. Roy followed her outside. "It's getting dark, Miss Dawson. Let me see you home." She hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. "Mr. Hollister, while I appreciate your concern, I've been managing on my own for quite some time." "Never doubted that," Roy said. "But there's been talk of coyotes on the North Road, and it's on my way back to Henderson's anyhow." This wasn't strictly true. The ranch lay east of town, not north, but Rebecca didn't need to know that. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Very well, thank you." The ride to Rebecca's homestead was mostly silent, but it was a comfortable quiet, occasionally broken by observations about the weather or comments about the surrounding land. As they approached her property, Roy could make out the silhouette of a modest but well-maintained house, a small barn, and what appeared to be a kitchen garden. "It's not much," Rebecca said, echoing her earlier words, "but it's home." "Looks like a fine place," Roy replied sincerely. As they pulled up to the house, Roy dismounted to help Rebecca down from the wagon. Their hands met briefly, and he was struck by the strength in her grip. These weren't the soft hands of a woman who shied away from hard work. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked suddenly, then immediately looked embarrassed at her own forwardness. "That is, if you're not in a hurry to get back." Roy found himself smiling. "Coffee sounds good, Miss Dawson." Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, with handmade quilts, practical furniture, and a few carefully chosen ornaments that suggested this was a home, not just a shelter. Rebecca busied herself at the stove while Roy took a seat at the kitchen table, removing his hat and placing it beside him. "You've made a real home here," he observed. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder. "It was my father's place originally. He homesteaded here after my mother died." "I was 15 then. Just the two of you." "Yes. He taught me everything: how to manage accounts, tend to livestock, repair fences." She placed a steaming cup before him. "Things a son would learn, I suppose. He had no choice but to teach his daughter instead. Seems like he did right by you." Rebecca took the seat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own cup. "He did, though I'm not sure he intended for me to be running this place alone at 32. The number hung in the air between them. Roy had guessed she was around that age, but hearing her say it so directly, with a hint of defiance in her tone, made him realize how accustomed she was to being judged for it. "My mother ran our family ranch alone for 12 years after my father died," Roy said after taking a sip of coffee. "I was 16 when he passed, my brother 14. She could have remarried, had offers, but chose not to. Said she'd already found her one great love." Rebecca's expression softened. "She sounds remarkable." "She was," Roy agreed. "Taught me that strength comes in different forms." Some men never learn that lesson. Their eyes met across the table and something unspoken passed between them. "Mr. Hollister, Roy," he corrected gently. "If we're sharing coffee in your kitchen, seems we could use first names." A smile tugged at her lips. "Roy then, and I'm Rebecca." "Rebecca," he repeated, liking the feel of her name. "Why were you at the Whitfield house today? You went there even before you knew about the sick boy." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Clara's husband died last winter, left her with 3 children and a mountain of debt he'd hidden from her. I've been helping her sort through the financial mess, teaching her to manage what little they have left." "That's generous of you." "It's not charity," Rebecca said firmly. "It's community. We look after each other out here." "Have to," Roy nodded. "Known a lot of places that could use more of that thinking." They continued talking as they finished their coffee, discovering shared views on many things despite their different paths in life. As the mantel clock struck 8, Roy reluctantly stood. "Should be getting back. Henderson likes to know where his people are." Rebecca walked him to the door. "Thank you again for your help today and for seeing me home." "My pleasure," Roy said, settling his hat back on his head. "Maybe I'll see you in town again soon." "I'd like that," she replied, surprising herself with her honesty. As Roy rode back toward Henderson's ranch in the gathering darkness, he found himself thinking about Rebecca's steady gaze and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. He hadn't come to Tulsa looking for anything beyond work, but he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, a pull that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with admiration. For her part, Rebecca stood on her porch watching Roy's silhouette disappear into the night, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. It had been a long time since a man had looked at her the way Roy did, like he truly saw her, age and all, and wasn't searching for something younger or different. It was both refreshing and terrifying. With a sigh, she went back inside to finish her evening chores, trying not to dwell on the possibility of seeing him again or the foolishness of hoping for something more. The weeks that followed saw Roy making increasingly frequent trips into Tulsa, each time finding a reason to visit wherever Rebecca might be. Sometimes they merely exchanged pleasantries. Other times, they managed longer conversations about books, ranching, or local happenings. It was during one such conversation outside the post office that Roy finally gathered his courage. "Rebecca," he began, after they discussed the latest news about railroad expansion, "I was wondering if you might join me for dinner Saturday evening, at the hotel restaurant." Her eyes widened slightly. "Dinner, unless you're otherwise engaged," Roy added quickly, suddenly uncertain. "No, Rebecca hesitated, then smiled. "I would enjoy that very much, Roy." "Good," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I'll call for you at 6. 6 would be perfect." As Rebecca walked away, Roy couldn't help but notice the curious stares from passers-by who had witnessed their exchange. It seemed their growing friendship hadn't gone unnoticed in the small community. Word traveled fast in Tulsa. By the time Saturday arrived, most of the town knew that the new foreman from Henderson's ranch was courting Rebecca Dawson. The reactions ranged from supportive to skeptical, with more than a few wondering why a man like Roy would choose a woman considered past her prime. Rebecca was well aware of the whispers as she prepared for the evening. She chose her best dress, a deep burgundy that complemented her complexion, and spent extra time arranging her hair. It had been years since she'd put such effort into her appearance, and she felt both nervous and exhilarated. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, she found Roy standing there in clean, pressed clothing, his usually wild hair tamed, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Rebecca felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." He offered her the flowers with a slightly embarrassed smile. "Not much, but thought you might like them." "They're lovely," she said sincerely, taking the bouquet. "Let me put these in water before we go." The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Tulsa, which wasn't saying much compared to bigger cities, but it represented a special occasion nonetheless. As Roy escorted Rebecca to their table, she was acutely aware of the eyes following them. "Everyone's watching," she murmured as they sat down. Roy glanced around the room before meeting her gaze. "Let them. I'm only interested in the company at this table." His straightforwardness eased her tension. Throughout the meal, they talked easily, laughing often and discovering more common ground. Roy told her about his years on the trail, his family back in Texas, and his decision to settle in Oklahoma. Rebecca shared stories of her childhood, her father's influence, and her dreams for her homestead. "I want to expand the vegetable garden next spring," she explained. "Maybe add a few fruit trees, the land's good for it." "Sounds like a fine plan," Roy agreed, "though that's a lot of work for one person." Rebecca smiled wryly. "I'm not afraid of hard work." "Never thought you were," Roy replied. "It's one of the things I admire about you." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "Most men seem to find it off-putting, that and my age." Roy's expression hardened slightly. "Most men are fools, even Horace Bingham." She asked, referring to the wealthy businessman whose rejection had been the talk of the town. "Especially him," Roy said firmly. "Any man who can't see your worth beyond your ability to bear children doesn't deserve your consideration." Rebecca felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "That's a rare perspective in these parts." "Maybe," Roy acknowledged, "but I've seen enough of life to know what matters. A good partner is about more than youth or appearances. It's about character, intelligence, shared values." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "Things you have in abundance." The warmth that spread through Rebecca had nothing to do with the restaurant's temperature. For the first time in years, She allowed herself to hope that perhaps she wasn't destined to face the future alone after all. As they finished their meal, Roy paid the bill and offered Rebecca his arm. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, stars punctuating the dark sky above. "May I walk you home?" Roy asked. "It's 3 miles," Rebecca reminded him. "I brought my wagon." "Then may I drive you home?" he amended with a smile. The ride back to Rebecca's homestead was peaceful. As they approached her house, Roy slowed the horses. "I've enjoyed this evening," he said quietly. "As have I," Rebecca replied. "More than I expected to." When they reached her door, Roy helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Rebecca," he said, his voice low, "I'd like to call on you again, properly." She looked up at him, searching his face in the moonlight. "You understand what people will say, that you could have your pick of younger women." Roy's expression remained steady. "I don't care what people say. And I've already found the woman I want to court if she'll have me." Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that very much." The smile that spread across Roy's face was answer enough. Slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. It was brief but filled with promise. "Good night, Rebecca," he said, stepping back. "Good night, Roy," she replied, her fingers unconsciously touching her lips as she watched him climb back into the wagon and turn toward town. As winter approached, Roy became a regular visitor at Rebecca's homestead. They settled into a comfortable routine. He would come by after work at the ranch, often helping with repairs or chores before they shared a meal and conversation by the fire. On Sundays, they attended church together, ignoring the curious glances and whispers that gradually gave way to acceptance as their courtship continued. Not everyone approved, of course. Horace Bingham, in particular, seemed put out by Roy's attentions to the woman he had rejected, though he kept his displeasure to veiled comments and cold stares. Others simply couldn't understand what Roy saw in a woman they considered too old and too independent. "Does it bother you?" Roy asked one evening as they sat on Rebecca's porch watching the sunset. "The talk?" Rebecca considered the question. "Less than it once would have. I've spent too many years worrying about others' opinions." Roy nodded, taking her hand in his. "Good, because I've been thinking." "A dangerous pastime," she teased. "Indeed," he agreed with a chuckle. "Rebecca, I'm not a man who believes in wasting time once I know what I want." Her heartbeat quickened as she sensed the direction of his words. "And what is it you want, Roy Hollister?" she asked softly. Roy turned to face her fully, his expression serious but tender. "You by my side for the rest of our days." Rebecca felt her breath catch. "Roy, let me finish," he said gently. "I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but out here life is uncertain and often short. When you find something good, someone good, you hold on with both hands." He squeezed her fingers. "I love you, Rebecca. I want to marry you if you'll have me." Tears sprang to Rebecca's eyes. "People will say you're settling, that you could do better." "Then people would be wrong," Roy said firmly. "There is no better than you, not for me." "I may never be able to give you children," she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Roy lifted her chin with his finger. "I'm not asking you to marry me for children. I'm asking because I want to build a life with you. If children come, they'll be a blessing. If not, we'll still have each other, and that's more than enough." A tear slipped down Rebecca's cheek. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I will marry you, Roy Hollister." Joy spread across Roy's face as he pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. They decided on a small wedding in early December, before the worst of the winter weather set in. Rebecca spent the weeks leading up to the ceremony finalizing arrangements, and preparing her home for Roy's arrival. Though he had suggested they might find a new place together, she was attached to her father's homestead, and Roy understood its importance to her. The night before their wedding, an unexpected visitor arrived at Rebecca's door. She opened it to find Horace Bingham standing on her porch, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Bingham," she said, surprised. "What brings you here so late?" "May I come in, Miss Dawson?" he asked stiffly. Reluctantly, Rebecca stepped aside to allow him entry. "I was just preparing for tomorrow, the wedding, you know." "Yes, that's why I'm here." Horace removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I feel I must speak up before you make a grave mistake." Rebecca's back stiffened. "A mistake?" "This hasty marriage to Hollister. He's barely been in town 3 months. What do you really know about him?" "I know everything I need to know," Rebecca replied coldly. Horace shook his head. "Did you know he was involved in a shooting in Kansas 2 years ago, that he killed a man?" Rebecca's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "Roy has been honest about his past." This wasn't entirely true. While Roy had mentioned his time in Kansas, he hadn't shared details of any violent incidents. Still, Rebecca refused to give Horace the satisfaction of seeing her doubt. "Has he told you why he really left Texas? About the gambling debts, the women?" Horace pressed. "Mr. Bingham," Rebecca interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing thoughts. "I appreciate your concern, but my decision is made. I love Roy and he loves me. Whatever his past holds, we will face it together." Horace's expression hardened. "I see. Well, I've done my duty in warning you. Don't come crying to me when you discover the kind of man you've tied yourself to." "I wouldn't dream of it," Rebecca said, moving toward the door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have preparations to complete." After Horace left, Rebecca sat heavily in her father's old chair, her mind whirling with questions. Could there be truth to Horace's accusations? Or was this merely the spite of a rejected suitor who couldn't bear to see her happy with someone else? She was still sitting there, lost in thought, when another knock came at the door. This time it was Clara Whitfield, arms laden with baked goods for the wedding celebration. "Rebecca, why, you look like you've seen a ghost," Clara exclaimed upon seeing her friend's face. Rebecca managed a weak smile. "Just wedding nerves, I suppose." Clara set down her basket and took Rebecca's hands. "Nonsense. I know that look. Something's troubling you." Hesitantly, Rebecca shared Horace's visit and his allegations about Roy's past. "And you believe that pompous windbag?" Clara asked incredulously. "I don't know what to believe," Rebecca admitted. "Roy hasn't spoken much about his life before Tulsa." Clara squeezed her hands. "Then ask him. That man adores you, Rebecca. Whatever truths he has to tell, he'll share them if you ask directly." Rebecca nodded slowly. "You're right. I need to speak with him." "Tonight?" "Yes, tonight." Rebecca stood, her resolve strengthening. "I won't begin our marriage with secrets between us." It was nearly 9 o'clock when Rebecca arrived at Roy's cabin on Henderson's ranch. Light still glowed from the windows and smoke curled from the chimney against the cold night sky. Roy opened the door at her knock, surprise evident on his face. "Rebecca, is everything all right?" "I need to speak with you," she said, stepping inside when he moved aside. "It's important." Roy's expression grew concerned as he took in her serious demeanor. "What's happened?" Rebecca took a deep breath. "Horace Bingham came to see me tonight. He had some stories about your past." Understanding dawned in Roy's eyes, followed by a flash of anger. "I see. He mentioned a shooting in Kansas, gambling debts in Texas." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "I don't believe his tales outright, but I need to hear the truth from you, Roy, all of it, before tomorrow." Roy was quiet for a long moment, then gestured toward the small table. "Sit down. I'll make coffee. This might take a while." As they sat across from each other, steam rising from their cups, Roy began his story. "There was a shooting in Kansas," he admitted. "2 years ago in Dodge City. A cattle buyer named Matthews accused me of cheating at cards. When I denied it, he drew on me." Roy's face was grim. "I was faster. The sheriff ruled it self-defense, but I left town soon after. Didn't sit right killing a man even if I had no choice." Rebecca nodded slowly. "And Texas? The gambling debts, half-truths at best," Roy said. "I did gamble in my younger days, lost more than I should have once or twice, but I paid every debt before leaving Texas." His eyes held hers. "As for women, there were some in different towns over the years, no one serious, no promises made or broken. Why didn't you tell me before?" Roy sighed. "Part of me was afraid that knowing I'd taken a life even in self-defense might change how you saw me, and part of me wanted to leave that man behind. The drifter, the gunslinger when necessary. I came to Tulsa looking for something different." "And did you find it?" Rebecca asked quietly. "I found you," Roy replied simply. "Everything I never knew I was looking for." Rebecca studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. She found none, only the open, honest gaze of the man she'd come to love. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said finally. "Does it change things?" Roy asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "For tomorrow," Rebecca reached across the table to take his hand. "No, it doesn't change anything. We all have pasts, Roy. What matters is the future we build together." Relief washed over his features. "I love you, Rebecca Dawson." "And I love you, Roy Hollister," she replied. "Even the parts of you that you'd rather leave behind." Their wedding day dawned clear and cold. The small church in Tulsa was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, a festive touch for the December ceremony. Only a few close friends were invited: Clara Whitfield and her children, Mr. Mason, Doc Miller, and several of Roy's colleagues from Henderson's ranch. Rebecca wore a new dress of deep blue, with a lace collar that had belonged to her mother. As she prepared in a small room at the back of the church, Clara helped pin white flowers in her hair. "You look radiant," Clara said, stepping back to admire her work. "Absolutely beautiful." Rebecca smiled, a hint of nervousness in her expression. "I never thought I'd be here, not at my age." Clara laughed. 32 is hardly ancient, Rebecca, and look at the good man waiting for you out there. Some things are worth the wait." A knock at the door interrupted them. The Reverend poked his head in. "Ready, Miss Dawson? Your groom is getting anxious." "Yes," Rebecca said, gathering her small bouquet. "I'm ready." The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. Rebecca would later remember little of the Reverend's words, but the look in Roy's eyes as she walked toward him would stay with her forever, a mixture of awe, love, and absolute certainty. When it came time for vows, Roy spoke clearly, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "I, Roy Hollister, take thee, Rebecca Dawson, to be my lawful wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." Rebecca repeated the sacred words, her heart full to bursting. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Roy's kiss was gentle, but filled with promise. The small reception at Rebecca's, now their home, was a joyful affair. Clara had organized a feast with help from the other women, and even Henderson himself made an appearance, gruffly congratulating his foreman on finally showing some sense. As the afternoon wore on, guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the house that would now be their shared home. "Well, Mrs. Hollister," Roy said, coming to stand behind her as she watched the last wagon disappear down the road. "How does it feel?" Rebecca leaned back against his chest, his arms encircling her waist. "Wonderful. And a bit surreal if I'm honest. Having second thoughts, he teased, though there was a hint of genuine question in his voice. Rebecca turned in his arms to face him. Not a single one. You. Roy's answer was a kiss that left no room for doubt. That night, as they lay together in the darkness of what was now their bedroom, Rebecca marveled at how quickly life could change. 3 months ago, she had resigned herself to a solitary existence, her dreams of marriage and family set aside. Now, she was a wife, cherished and desired by a man who saw her not as too old or too independent, but as perfectly suited to him in every way. "What are you thinking about?" Roy asked, his voice low in the darkness as he traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "How fortunate I am," she replied honestly. "How grateful that you rode into Tulsa when you did." "I'm the fortunate one," Roy countered. "Found a home and a wife all in one journey." He paused. "You know, I never really had a home of my own before, not since leaving my mother's place in Texas. And now I have everything a man could want," he said simply, pulling her closer. "Right here in my arms." Spring came to Oklahoma with its usual vigor, painting the prairie with wildflowers and fresh green growth. The months since their wedding had settled Roy and Rebecca into a comfortable rhythm of shared work and domestic harmony. Roy continued as foreman at Henderson's ranch, but increasingly devoted his free time to improvements on their homestead. Together, they expanded the vegetable garden as Rebecca had planned, planted fruit trees, and added a second room to the small house. It was during the building of this addition that Rebecca first noticed the changes in her body, subtle at first, then unmistakable. She kept her suspicions to herself for weeks, not daring to hope until she was certain. Finally, one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she could contain her news no longer. "Roy," she began, her voice betraying her excitement, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, setting aside the bridle he'd been mending. "What is it?" "I'm with child," she said, the words sending a thrill through her even as she spoke them. "We're going to have a baby." Roy's expression shifted from surprise to wonder to joy in the span of seconds. "A baby, you're sure?" Rebecca nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "Doc Miller confirmed it today. He estimates the baby will come in late October." In one fluid movement, Roy was kneeling before her, his hands cradling her face. "Rebecca, this is. I never dared hope." "Nor did I," she admitted, covering his hands with her own. "At my age, I thought it unlikely." "You're 32, not 60, Roy said with a laugh, echoing the thought she'd had so many months ago when facing Horace Bingham's rejection. "Still plenty young enough for motherhood." "It seems so," Rebecca agreed, smiling through her tears. Roy placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "A child," he said wonderingly. "Our child." The news of Rebecca's pregnancy spread quickly through Tulsa, eliciting a range of reactions. Most were genuinely happy for the couple, particularly Clara Whitfield, who immediately appointed herself Rebecca's unofficial midwife and advisor. Others, including Horace Bingham, received the news with obvious disbelief and some resentment. Rebecca overheard him in Mason's store one afternoon, muttering about miracles for some and not others, a clear reference to his own childless first marriage, which had ended with his wife's death 3 years prior. Rebecca paid such comments little mind. Her focus was entirely on preparing for the baby and continuing to build her life with Roy. As her body changed and her pregnancy progressed, she found herself marveling at the journey that had brought her here from resigned spinsterhood, beloved wife and expectant mother in less than a year. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it," she confessed to Roy one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly. "That all of this is really happening." "Believe it," Roy said, pressing a kiss to her temple. You deserve every happiness, Rebecca. I'm just grateful I get to be the one to share it with you. The baby, a boy they named James after Rebecca's father, arrived on a crisp October morning after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. When Rebecca finally held her son in her arms, his tiny face scrunched and red, she felt a love so overwhelming it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "He's perfect," Roy whispered, perched on the edge of the bed beside them. "Absolutely perfect. He is, isn't he?" Rebecca agreed, gently stroking the downy dark hair that already covered the infant's head. "Hello, James. We've been waiting for you." Roy's finger was immediately captured in a surprisingly strong grip. "Strong like his mother," he said with a proud smile. "And stubborn, like his father, I imagine," Rebecca added with a tired laugh. As Roy gazed at his wife and newborn son, he felt a contentment he'd never known possible. The restlessness that had driven him for so many years was gone, replaced by a bone-deep certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. "I love you," he said simply. "Both of you." Rebecca looked up at him, her eyes shining despite her exhaustion. "And we love you." In the years that followed, the Hollister family thrived. Their homestead grew more prosperous, with Roy eventually leaving Henderson's employment to work their land full-time. James grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's adventurous spirit and his mother's quick mind. To everyone's surprise, including her own, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, when James was 3. Though the pregnancy was more difficult than her first, the joy of adding to their family made every discomfort worthwhile. Occasionally, Rebecca would encounter one of the men who had rejected her years before. Horace Bingham, in particular, seemed to have never fully reconciled himself to her happiness, though he had remarried a woman 20 years his junior who gave him the sons he'd so desperately wanted. During one such encounter at the general store, Horace made a point of commenting on her children. "Fine-looking boy you have there, Mrs. Hollister. The girl takes after you, I think." Rebecca smiled politely. "Thank you, Mr. Bingham. How are your own children?" "Growing like weeds," he replied before adding with a pointed look, "My wife is expecting our third. She's only 25, you know, plenty of good years ahead." The barb was intended to sting, but Rebecca found herself merely pitying the man. "How fortunate for you both," she said sincerely. Children are a blessing at any age. Later, when she recounted the conversation to Roy, he shook his head in disbelief. "That man will never understand what he missed by passing you over." "His loss was my gain," Rebecca replied, leaning into her husband's embrace as they watched their children play in the yard. "I found the man who thought I was perfect just as I was." Roy pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Not thought, Rebecca. No, you're perfect for me, always have been." As the sun set over their homestead, painting the Oklahoma sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The rejection that had once caused her such pain had led her to the greatest happiness of her life: a loving husband, beautiful children, and the knowledge that some things were indeed worth waiting for. In the gathering twilight, with Roy's arm around her waist and their children's laughter filling the air, Rebecca Dawson Hollister knew with absolute certainty that she had found her perfect match, a man who saw beyond society's narrow expectations to the woman she truly was. And in that acceptance, that recognition of her worth beyond her years or her ability to bear children, she had found not just love, but home.